Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. We're a consortium of about 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guests today are from the great state of Michigan. Paul J. Erickson is the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library. And Cheney Schopieray is the curator of manuscripts at the Clements Library, which is a tremendous place in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I'll let Cheney and Paul tell us more about the Clements Library and why everyone interested in the American Revolution should pay a visit or check out their website. So, Paul, why don't you tell us about the Clements Library?
Sure. And Bob, thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. And thanks to Jonathan Lane for all his work arranging this. It's great to be with you. So the Clements Library is absolutely one of the treasures of the University of Michigan campus, of the state of Michigan, as well as of the sort of ecosystem of special collections libraries focused on early Americana around the country. As you saw, the Clements Library is right at the heart of the University of Michigan Central Campus in Ann Arbor. We're directly next door to the president's house on South University Avenue. The Clements Library was founded in 1923, so last year was our centennial.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And as you would expect, it was founded by a man named William Clements, who was born in Ann Arbor in 1861. His father was a faculty member at the university. He grew up here in town, attended the university. He was one of the first engineering students at the University of Michigan. And when he graduated, he went to work for a company that his father had a connection with in Northeast Michigan called the Bay City Industrial Works. And the Industrial Works made big industrial machines that were mounted on rail cars, things like cranes and steam shovels and hoists. He eventually became the president of the company, became a wealthy man. And in addition, was elected to the Board of Regents of the University of Michigan, where he served for over 20 years. In the late 19th century, he became interested in book collecting, thanks to a group of folks in Bay City that he became connected with, and formed a very strong collection of materials related to European contact in the Americas, as well as the colonial period in North America. And in 1921, he decided to donate that collection to the University of Michigan, along with money to build the building, because he felt that a great university needed a great collection of early Americana, thinking about collections on the East Coast. And particularly, he was inspired by the example of the John Carter Brown Library. So he donated his collection of mostly books and maps to the university, along with money to build the building. We opened in 1923. And if you know collectors, you know that it's not a bug that passes easily. So he donated his collection, and then he went back home to Bay City, and his shelves were empty, and he was kind of sad. Wow. And so Henry Stevens was the agent he worked with in England who had helped him build his collection, and he got in touch with Mr. Clements and said, there are some large manuscript collections related to the history of the American Revolution that are still in family hands in Britain that might be available for sale. If you were interested. He hadn't really collected manuscripts in a concerted way before. And so that he embarked on a second wave of collecting, and that brought the Revolutionary War collections to the Clements that are still our most heavily used and most frequently cited collections. Papers of Thomas Gage and Henry Clinton and other folks that Cheney will talk about in a bit, that combined really make the Clements the best place in the U.S. to study the British side of the war.
It's really amazing that you have these collections.
It's incredible, and people always ask, well, why are these collections in Michigan? Why aren't they in London, or why aren't they in Boston or New York? And the answer is that this was kind of the golden age of collecting for wealthy Americans, and Mr. Clements had both the money to get the things that he was interested in, but I think more importantly, he had a very specific focus for his collecting, compared with other folks who were building large collections at the time, like J.P. Morgan and Henry Huntington. And he was very smart about the way he went about it. So we now have 4 collecting divisions: manuscripts, maps, graphics, and printed books. We have we have close to 1,000 undergraduate students come to the Clements for class sessions to work with original materials every semester. It's one of the great things about being located on a big research university campus. And we give close to 30 visiting research fellowships every year for people to come use the collections.
Oh, great.
And Cheney, I'll turn it over to Cheney, who can talk a bit more about our Revolutionary War manuscript collections and what we do with them.
Yes, one of the aspects of the Clements Library's collections that is particularly amazing to me, having been here for 20 years plus, I'm still amazed at how well the collections intertwine with one another. And the Revolutionary War collections certainly do. But I'd like to preface this also by saying that the Clements collections extend well beyond the Revolution and well beyond the world of military papers. We have in the manuscripts division well over 3,000 collections of materials that range from teenage girls' diaries in the 1890s to the letters of General Washington and Greene that are part of the Revolutionary collection. So as I talk about these, just think of them as the sort of tip of the iceberg, although the tip that's by far the most well-known and most utilized at the library. So it's difficult to try to summarize the scope of our revolutionary holdings. Certainly we have Mr. Clements was collecting the printed materials and books and broadsides and so on. But in manuscripts, now I think if we were to stack the papers on top of one another, they'd be at least a couple 100 feet high. We have, I think nearly 200 collections that have part or all of them pertinent to the Revolutionary era. Paul mentioned the most well-known, which Mr. Clements had acquired. They're also the most extensive. He acquired in the 1920s the papers of General Thomas Gage, who had served under Jeffrey Amherst during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in the Americas, and then inherited some of Amherst's papers and set to developing his own as he became first governor of Montreal in 1760, and then commander of the British forces in North America from 1763 until the outbreak of the Revolution. So for his collection, we're talking about somewhere around 23,010 manuscripts, letters, documents, and other materials that really represent the highest level of both military and administration in the colonies. So anyone who's submitting petitions to the British government, people who are contractors for the army, they're all writing to and from Gage from posts ranging from as far south in the Caribbean as the British had posts to up into Canada, and as far west as the areas in what had been French-controlled areas before 1763. So it really is an extraordinary collection for the study of British North America during that time. Those were acquired in 1930. Earlier, he had acquired the papers of Henry Clinton, who had served under William Howe beginning in 1775 during the Revolution, and then during the American Revolution, and then took over command of the army in 1778. And so the 17,000 or so manuscripts that comprise his collection represent the sort of apparatus of every aspect of the British Army from the commanding general's perspective. We also have papers of British auxiliary German forces, the mercenaries that were hired by George III to fight. So the papers of Freiherr von Jungkenn include journals and reports and letters and so on, much of them written in German Schrift and also French, but a couple of linear feet of his materials. Please feel free to interrupt me. I can talk at length, but
this is great. Now we're talking with Cheney Schopieray, who is the curator of manuscripts at the William L. Clements Library in Ann Arbor, as well as Paul Erickson, who is the Randolph Adams director of the Clements Library, about this extraordinary collection that William Clements gathered in the early 20th century and donated. And you've done some really interesting things. They have this great online exhibit on the art of resistance in early America, which, again, it is the tip of an iceberg. You show some of the really interesting things. You have, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, as well as Phyllis Wheatley's Book of Poetry, but then also this rebus of America to Her Mistaken Mother from, I think, 1778. I mean, really interesting ways that, you can get at this history with the documents and the collections you have. I don't know if that was a question or just a statement about what a great place the Clements Library is. You also have George Germain's papers. He was one of the interesting things about the characters whose papers you collected is they often didn't really like each other or get along with each other. And, reading Henry Clinton, everything would have been much different if people had listened to him. And I wonder if you get a sense of that, now you have all of these papers gathered in the same place.
You do, and you also very much get an impression of how the length of time it takes to transmit messages can have the effect that can have on the way that these relationships can or cannot establish themselves productively. So certainly there's frustration in transatlantic correspondence when the orders from London are taking 6 weeks to get there. The one thing I would like to mention, though, I had mentioned just a few collections. Just the scope of the Revolutionary War collections are much broader. And without going into details of the names of the collections, I wanted to make sure that, listeners also know that we have also materials from the American revolutionaries and French allies. We have military collections. We also have papers on politics and diplomacy and finance. We have mercantile papers of merchants that are both contracted and folks just trying to operate their businesses during wartime. And plenty from loyalists as well as loyalists to the crown and colonists as well. So just make sure that I mentioned that.
It really gives you a perspective on how you mentioned 3 different languages that you have collections in, and I suspect there are more than French, German, and English. And I'm wondering about any Native American perspectives or other underrepresented voices you may find in these various collections, women, prisoners of war.
I would just say that one of the most exciting things that we see in how our collections get used, and I think a trend that see also more broadly in the scholarship on the period in general, is that people are using collections like Gage and Clinton and Germain to research precisely those perspectives that people who've been using those collections for the last 100 years weren't looking for. So these collections are incredibly rich resources for women's history, African American history, Native American history, precisely because these people were involved in everything.
Right.
So, Cheney can talk a bit more specifically about how those voices either appear or don't in these collections. But the fact that these people just had so many connections to everything. We have a research fellow here now, and she's one of a sort of large number of researchers we've had in the last couple of years who are doing work on Native American people in the South. in particular, she's working on the Cherokee, but we've had a lot of people here doing research on the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and their relations with the different empires that they came in contact with in the second half of the 18th century. And these collections, which are as traditional and you could say elite as they get, are tremendous resources for finding some of those underrepresented voices.
So it's not just using, say, the Gage papers to learn about Thomas Gage, but you have all of these connections between Gage and others. And Clinton certainly is thinking about the Southern campaign. He's thinking about this in a way different from the way we think about it, because the Cherokee are also at war with South Carolina and they're allies of the British. So you get this different lens, and mining these collections, it really is a fascinating development in scholarship.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a few examples, of places where African Americans, for example, appear in the records are in your general military returns, a type of paperwork that's just reporting on the status of different units in the Army. But you'll find, for example, the Black pioneers who served in the British Army. You'll find a letter from Murphy Steele in the collection, so directly from the voice of a person who's experiencing events. You'll find more often than not those single lines in documents that once the thread's pulled, you find you can start to tell stories that you wouldn't have known existed previously. And certainly the interactions between the British and indigenous populations are, the papers are certainly filled with all manner of communications and council meetings and other interactions with the native populations from Michilimackinac to to the eastern seaboard. So.
Wow, it's amazing. Now, do you have to be a student at the University of Michigan or an academic to use the Clements Library? Can you tell us a bit about how someone would access the collections?
Sure. We are part of a public university, so we are open to the public, which is one of the great things about being at the Clements Library. So anybody who has a project that would make use of the collections can make an appointment and come do research here. We're open Monday through Friday, 9 to 4:30, except Thursdays we open at 10. And we certainly, we're delighted that students and faculty at the University of Michigan use the collection. That's why we're on the campus of the university, to be a resource for students and faculty. But anybody can make use of the collections.
And you've been digitizing things as well. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Sure, we have. So this is digitization is a crucial element of every library's work these days to make their collections more accessible, both to scholars who are doing different types of history, digital history, as well as people who, for a variety of reasons, aren't able to travel to visit libraries and archives. And we have taken the approach of digitizing kind of sort of our highest priority, most used collections first. And we've been lucky to get a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to help us digitize the Gage papers, which is work that Cheney has been leading along with our digital projects librarian, Emmy Hastings. So Cheney can talk a bit more about the digitization of Gage and how that's working and what it's going to permit scholars to do with the papers.
Sure. We have, over the course of the last couple of years, thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities, we were able to hire digitization technicians to begin at the beginning of the Thomas Gage papers, scan the materials, crop them appropriately, color correct them, and create item level metadata, which is currently the last work in process for making those materials accessible. You will find the first, the English series of the Gage papers, the transatlantic correspondence primarily. The first 30 volumes of the papers are live and available for access online. And we are in the last stages of getting the next group, which is the first big bundle of the American series. They're chronologically arranged, so it's the 7 Years' War period mostly. But the aim is to get up through Lexington and Concord as soon as we can, since the 250th is coming up very soon. So. But the goal is to make those materials accessible to the widest possible audience. And the sorts of research that can be done digitally with the metadata that's provided, which includes, the date something's created and received, the sorts of larger picture looks at the collection and how the materials relate to one another, is something that we look forward to seeing what scholars can do with.
Back in the early days of digitization, I know there was I heard some discussion among research libraries, if everything is available online, why will people come here? Now, have you found a decline in usage of the library since things have been digitized?
So my experience has been exactly the opposite. First of all, no library is ever going to be able to digitize everything. People always ask when they visit what percentage of our collection has been digitized, and it's less than 10, significantly less. We'll never digitize everything that we have. So I'm not worried about that so much. And my experience has been that the more materials get digitized, it actually drives more attendance to the library, because things are more discoverable. So people search online, they find out that one collection is digitized, and then they do more research into what's at the library, and they realize they need to come visit in person. So I don't think we're ever going to be at a point where nobody will need to come visit a place like the Clements, because everything's available on their screen. But even if we were somehow magically able to digitize everything, it doesn't replicate the experience of being here, mainly because you would not have the experience of interacting with staff who know the collections deeply and are aware of connections between different items in the collection that you can't necessarily put in metadata. But if you're here and can talk to people, you can get sent in those productive research directions.
Right. We're talking with Cheney Schopieray from the Clements Library, the curator of manuscripts, and Paul Erickson, the director of the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Tremendous collections on the Revolutionary War, as well as other things. And you mentioned you have about 30 fellows. Can you tell us a bit about what the fellowship program is, and how, say, a scholar, a graduate student, academic, or a professor might want to have access to the collections for an extended period?
Sure. Well, those people who want to have access to the collections through our fellowship program should get busy, because our deadline is January 15th.
Okay.
So we give, as I said, we give about 30 research fellowships every year for periods ranging from a week to a semester. And some of them are thematic in nature. So we have fellowships that are specifically for the study of Native American history, for the study of history of the Great Lakes, for the history of the Atlantic world, and others are sort of more general in nature. But we have everybody from undergraduates to senior faculty applying for fellowships to come spend time at the Clements and make use of the collections. In particular, we're excited about a couple new fellowships we have that are designed to bring people in to use our visual collections, ephemera and graphic arts and photography in particular. Those are collections that, just because of their nature, we have large numbers of items are difficult to digitize. And so if you want to use collections like that, you really need to visit a library in person. And so we're excited to see what people are able to do with those opportunities.
I wonder, you have can you talk a little bit of the Lexington and Concord exhibit that you're working on?
Sure. Cheney can talk about that, as he is deeply
Great.
enmeshed in it right now.
Yes, we have an exhibit that's going to be physically at the Clements Library to open. That's expected to open on the 18th, which is a Friday of April of 2025. And one of the goals that I have with it, because there's certainly other institutions, definitely in Massachusetts, that are creating exhibits that also revolve around this first sort of engagement, engagement between the colonists and the British establishment. What I wanted to do with this exhibit is focus on materials that can't really be seen elsewhere. So, for example, Thomas Gage's draft orders to Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith in April 18th of 19th of 1775, ordering the Concord expedition, are part of Gage's papers. Also earlier, Gage's copies of in February of the formal statement from the British government that Massachusetts is in rebellion, the secret manuscript from the Earl of Dartmouth to Gage authorizing martial law or force if appropriate.
So you have that physical document that that triggers all of this.
Yeah. We have intelligence on the alarms and orderly books in which they're detaching the grenadiers and light infantry from units to march west. There are Percy's report of the reinforcement troops. All of those are part of Gage's papers, as well as secret as papers that were commandeered by Dr. Benjamin Church and delivered from him to thought to be on the rebellious side of the conflict, but turned out he was turning over materials to Gage, and so bundles of those from the 18th through the 22nd. And that includes a letter from Rachel Revere to Paul Revere, immediately after warning him not to come back to Boston.
Cheney, what about the myth that Margaret Kemble Gage might have been tipping off the Patriots? Can you say anything about that?
I prefer to let the historians discuss it. I usually say there's not evidence in the Gage papers to support that claim.
By the way, David Hackett Fisher said, "Don't mention this if you're at the Gage estate in England, that she might have been tipping them off, because they take it very seriously, and don't take the point of view that she was tipping off anyone." But it's good to know the evidence in the papers doesn't support that. It doesn't point to that.
Yeah, and it's a good point. We try and maintain relationships with descendants of persons, and that includes the Gage family. And so before our exhibit opens, we will have an event at which Deborah Gage will be coming to give a talk.
Wonderful.
And I have to make sure the schedule's right, but that's in early April before those events. So
it's amazing what you have, the story that you can tell from that, the perspective you get from the documents you have in the Clements Library.
And more. And I intend to, as you can tell, the final selection hasn't been made for this exhibit, but I intend to end with the declaration of martial law in early June. So of 75.
That's tremendous.
And that's also going to be the basis of an online exhibit that will cover the entire siege of Boston. So.
Oh yes, yeah.
All of our exhibits that go up in the reading room now have an online component as well. So even after an exhibit comes down, you mentioned our exhibit on arts and resistance earlier. That exhibit was up last year, but folks can still go online and see the exhibit there.
Yeah, it's tremendous, particularly for people who can't trek to the Concord Museum or the institutions here, which will be also telling the story, the Commonwealth Museum. Sure. You would definitely have a different way of telling the story. And I can say, I'm not going to tell you what you should do over the next 8 years, but you have plenty of material to continue doing revolutionary themed exhibits as we move through these 8 years and then beyond. I mean, we're interested in this no matter whether it's an anniversary or not.
Right. Yeah, and you know, folks sometimes don't think of places like Michigan as places where the revolution happened. But one of the great things about these collections is that they showed the geographic scope of the conflict, and even particularly beginning with the 7 Years' War, the Great Lakes were absolutely central to that conflict and to what was at stake for the empires that were in conflict then. And so it's particularly exciting for us to tell what is a familiar story to most people, Lexington and Concord, events like that, and be able to connect them to the place where the materials are.
Right. Yeah, Michilimackinac certainly loomed larger to them than perhaps it does to us on the East Coast now. I know when my own looking at the published Gage papers at the time of the occupation of Boston in the 1760s, when he's in New York, he's certainly not thinking about trouble in Massachusetts. He's thinking about where you are. And that's the reason you needed troops, is to protect the native people in along the Great Lakes. So do you have a lot on Michigan's history in the collections?
So there's another library on campus, the Bentley Historical Library, that has Michigan history as part of its particular focus. But that said, we have tremendous resources for the history of Michigan. In the 19th century, certainly, we have a large portion of the Lewis Cass papers, but also in the Revolutionary period. And Cheney can talk a bit more specifically about what some of those materials are.
Sure. In the manuscripts division, we have handwritten materials from the 17th century voyageurs to to materials from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with a few 20th century military collections as well from Michigan soldiers. But Paul mentioned the Lewis Cass papers. We also have the papers of the first congressman sent to the United States from the new state of Michigan in the 1830s, Lucius Lyon. And Lyon's papers are very expansive and provide much documentation of the establishment and creation of Michigan as a state entity. But he was also part of the handling claims by indigenous peoples for parts of annuity payments, especially related to mixed race persons who were making claims. And so within the Lyon papers are also a full linear foot of what are essentially petitions and genealogies and so on from largely Ojibwe men and women seeking those annuity payments.
Interesting.
Or sections of them. So
we're talking with Cheney Schopieray, who is the curator of manuscripts at the Clements Library, and Paul Erickson, who's the Randolph G. Adams director of the William L. Clements Library. Tremendous place to study this. You also mentioned maps earlier on, that Mr. Clements collected maps. Can we talk a little bit about your map collection?
Sure. The map collection is really spectacular. We have over 30,000 maps ranging from, early atlases of the world to late 19th, early 20th century maps of different native tribes, landholdings in what's now Oklahoma, and everything in between. One great thing about our map collection is that it is quite well cataloged. A large percentage of our map collection is in the online catalog, so it's easy for people to browse and discover things that we have. Just thinking about, in particular, our 18th century collections, one of the most exciting things that we've acquired in the last couple of years is a manuscript plan of the Fort of Detroit from 1761 that was drawn by a British military officer, William Brazier, at the request of Sir Geoffrey Amherst at the end of the 7 Years' War. Amherst wanted to know what the current status of the Fort of Detroit was, wanted to know what they were getting. So it's this absolutely beautifully preserved watercolor map of the Fort of Detroit with a wonderful perspective view of the fort, as well as inset at the bottom, which gives a different sense to researchers who are working with particularly the Gage papers of what these places looked like.
It's amazing. Cheney, you've been there for more than 20 years now. I wonder if you can tell us what's your latest favorite thing you've discovered in the collections?
Well, when my favorite thing at the library changes on a daily basis, sometimes hourly, but some materials really stick with you, and I think for me the part of this work, the part of interacting with primary source materials, with manuscripts in particular, is how close that physical object can bring you to the past that's represented and the people that are represented in them or whose handwriting produced them. So it's that physicality that can really bring you to it. And so when we talk to students, for example, that's one of the things that we try to impart, is that, like, what are you looking for in this document that takes you there, right, into the past? So things like the two favorites that are sticking with me at the moment. One is Revolution related, which is in the September of 1775. A woman named Mrs. Cook came to the Thomas Gage's headquarters and delivered a deposition on the state of troops outside of Boston. And I don't recall whose hand took it. It wasn't Gage's, but Mrs. Cook could speak Gaelic. And so she went around Roxbury, around the areas outside of Boston, and very diligently took mental note of quantities of ammunition, where people are located, how many people are where. And she was suspected in Washington and interacted with Washington, and then was set free to go back to Boston. So she went back and delivered that information to Gage. And that deposition means, like, when I look at that, you can picture that sort of event unfolding through her words and through the document itself. The other that I think of is one that came across my desk the other day, which was written in a very shaky hand in April of 1781. It's Bannister Tarleton. He had just come out of the battle at Guilford Courthouse and was heading down in North Carolina, and he had just had a couple of fingers shot off of his right hand. And so he was trying to write with his left hand. And so we can publish that letter, right? And we can type it out and we have the information conveyed. But when you see that shaky handwriting on that paper that he's writing from the field, you can sort of put yourself in the position, not of Bannister Tarleton, probably, that's certainly, but you can sort of better sort of picture the reality and the humanity of those sorts of events. So
it's amazing. It's really amazing. It does give you that connection that you don't get either if you see it on a screen or if you're reading a transcribed copy. And so, Paul, you've been at a number of institutions, including the American Antiquarian Society, which is one of our partner organizations. I wonder if, in your briefer time at the Clements, have you found a favorite thing?
Yeah, so I've been here for 5 years, and much like Cheney, my favorite thing changes on a daily basis. But similar to Cheney, the things that really grab me and stick with me are the things that put you in a room with somebody and can really give you a sense of the immediacy of someone's experience. And I'll just mention two things. One is an item that just came in last week. It's a late 19th century shorthand instruction manual, book to teach someone how to take shorthand. And there's a note inside the front cover from a woman who owned it, saying, this book enabled me to feed my two sons after their father died, and so it is worth more to me than gold.
Wow.
So, a pedestrian, we've got a lot of shorthand manuals in the collection, but this puts you in the room with a woman who's been widowed and has to figure out how to feed her kids. And this book helps her do that. And the other things, people always ask, what's the thing you would grab in the building if it was on fire? And I always say we go to great lengths to make sure the building never catches on fire. But so we hold the papers of the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, which was a group of upper middle class white abolitionist women in Rochester, New York, that was formed mostly to support Frederick Douglass's publication of his newspapers in Rochester. Right. And so the collection has minutes of their meetings and correspondence with various folks, including correspondence with Douglass. And a lot of it is sort of, formal, quasi-formal business correspondence. Susan Porter, the head of the society, will write to Douglass asking him to give a talk at an event, and he will write back saying he's too busy and that kind of thing. But there are, I don't know, 4 or 5, maybe 6, just little short notes on scraps of paper from Douglass to Susan Porter, asking her for money because he has a fugitive slave in his newspaper office. Frederick Douglass in the 1850s was the most famous Black man in America. And so people who were fleeing the South knew who he was and would come to Rochester looking for him. And there's one in particular, Douglass writes to Susan Porter saying, I have a man in my office right now named William Osborne, who is a fugitive from slavery. All he needs is $2.50 to get him to Canada. This note is written in February, and so every time I read it, I think about that man, William Osborne, who is frightened. He knows people are chasing him and looking for him. It's February in Rochester, New York. He's never been that cold in his life.
Yeah.
Never seen that much snow. And $2.50 is all that stands between him and liberty. And Douglass hastily writing this note to a woman who lives across town, asking her for help. That's the kind of thing that we can type it up and you can see the digitized version, but it's not the same as seeing it in person.
Amazing. Thank you. We've been talking with Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the William L. Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as well as Cheney Schopieray, who is the Curator of Manuscripts at the Clements Library. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's been great hearing more about this tremendous place.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation, Bob. It's been great having the chance to talk with you.
And I look forward to seeing you in the library at some point. That, by the way, it's great. You have a great paneled room to work in, Cheney. That's
Paul, this is now my office.
Well,
okay,
no.
Good. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, as well as our listeners around the country, around the world. And every week we thank folks who are tuning in regularly. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And if you're not in one of these places and still want some swag, also email Jonathan. And so this week I want to thank our listeners in Detroit, as well as in Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids, and in Overland Park, Kansas, and Dallas and Marietta in Georgia, Dublin, Edinburgh, and Toronto, Mays Landing, and Wayne, New Jersey. Anthony Wayne's a guy who's given his name to a lot of places, including the largest county in Michigan. Lexington and Arlington here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Araby, Louisiana, Vienna, Maine, Amman, Jordan, and places beyond and between. Thanks for joining us. Now we'll be piped out on the road to Boston.